Russia will continue to throw as many bodies as it can in Ukraine until it gets what it wants.
That's the voice of Kimberly St. Julian Varnon, a PhD student in history at the University of Pennsylvania. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plaster's Fun podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now here are your co-hosts, Tom Collina and Lauren Billet.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome back to Press the Button. Lauren, how was your weekend?
Hi, Tom. Great to see you. It was great. It was very relaxing. I even took a break from knitting my hat this weekend, but I'm anxiously waiting to pick it back up next weekend. But how was yours? I heard you had some fun traveling.
I did. My wife and I went to Philadelphia to visit our kids, and we wound up at the Renaissance Fair in Pennsylvania on Sunday. A lot of fun for you listeners out there who've never been to a Ren Fair, as they call them. It's an experience that you should have at least once. And so I highly recommend it. It was a lot of fun.
Well, next year I'm tagging along with you and your family, Tom. I'm inviting myself. But what do you have for us this week on nuclear news?
Well, lots of news. It seems 60 Minutes on CBS has been working overtime, and a lot of nuclear news was made on 60 Minutes this weekend. On the Iran deal, they did an interview with Iran's president, Ibrahim Raisi. And during that talk, he ruled out a meeting with President Joe Biden on the margins of the UN General Assembly. And he says that he sees no changes in reality from the Trump administration as far as the Iran deal goes, which clearly is not a good sign for the deal. And in the same interview, Raisi repeated the Iranian position that they want to guarantee that the United States would not withdraw from the deal again, as the Trump administration previously did. Although Biden has said he will stay in the deal as long as Iran does, the Biden team has been clear that they cannot speak for any future administration on this point. And we will have more on the Iran deal later in the show. 60 Minutes also taped an interview with President Biden. And in response to a question about what Biden would say to President Putin if President Putin were considering the use of chemical or nuclear weapons, Biden warned President Putin not to use chemical or a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, saying there would be a consequential response. Biden simply said, don't, and said that if Putin were to use chemical or nuclear weapons, Russia would become more of a pariah in the world than it has ever been. And in the same interview, Biden said that U.S. troops would defend Taiwan in the event of an invasion, presumably by China. But the White House quickly corrected this as not official U.S. policy. This is not the first time President Biden has had to be corrected on his statements about Taiwan. Finally, unfortunately, there has been shelling at yet another Ukrainian nuclear power plant, while the situation has stabilized somewhat around Zaporizhzhia, where UN inspectors are now located. Ukraine is reporting that Russian troops struck the Pivdonokransk nuclear power plant in Ukraine's southern region early Monday, but thankfully the reactors were not damaged. This is yet another example of Russia's recklessness when it comes to nuclear safety during this war, and we will discuss it more later in the episode, so stay tuned. Lauren, what do you have for us coming up on Early Warning?
This week on Early Warning, I sat down with Barbara Slavin, the Future of Iran Initiative Director and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. We discussed the recent developments in reviving the 2015 Iran nuclear deal and the potential of a breakthrough at the UN General Assembly, where the negotiating parties will be able to engage in side discussions.
And then I speak with Kimberly St. Julian Varnon at the University of Pennsylvania. We discuss Ukraine's recent counteroffensive, how Russia might respond, and what to expect going forward in the war. It's a great, timely conversation, so please stay tuned.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us to improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now,
Early warning.
early warning,
Early warning. Early warning.
a 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Jacqueline. The Iran nuclear deal remains stalled, and any new activity may be delayed until after the U.S. November midterm elections. The US and Europe are frustrated with Iran. Obviously, this is not the first time that we've found ourselves here. Is there potential, as the UN General Assembly meeting in New York concludes its first week, that the parties to the deal will take advantage of the diplomatic gathering to talk? Though not confirmed, it is possible that Iran's lead nuclear negotiator Ali Bagheri Khani, White House Special Envoy for Iran Rob Malley, and the senior EU official coordinating nuclear talks Enrique Mora will all be in New York. President Ibrahim Raisi is also due to attend. So, what should we expect? To help explain the situation, we are joined by Barbara Slavin. She is the director of the Future of Iran Initiative and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much for joining me today, Barbara.
Sure, it's my pleasure.
So can you give us a bit more background on the current status of talks to revive the 2015 Iran nuclear deal?
It's been a bit of a roller coaster. We've had some hopes that have been dashed at various times that the parties were going to reach an agreement. But just briefly remind everyone that Donald Trump quit this deal in 2018 when Iran was still in full compliance with it. So the problems that we're having now date back to that decision to withdraw from the agreement for, as far as I can tell, no good reason. Maybe domestic political reasons more than anything to do with nonproliferation. When Joe Biden came in, he appointed Rob Malley as his Iran envoy about a week after he came into office. But it took a little while to get talks going on a revival of the JCPOA. The US wanted to consult with various partners in the region and in Europe. And there was also the ticklish matter of placating anti-JCPOA head Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Menendez of New Jersey, who in a very closely divided Senate had a lot of power over confirmation of various administration officials for various posts. So it took a while. The talks didn't get started in Vienna until April of 2021. And while they made some progress in the first month or so, they ran into Iranian domestic politics, elections in June of 2021 that brought in a new administration, a new set of negotiators, very different from those who had negotiated the original Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. These are people who have not been educated in the West, who don't speak English. Many of them were strong opponents of the JCPOA the first time around. So it has been a slow and torturous process. Let me also add that the talks in Vienna have not been direct between the United States and Iran. Iran refuses to sit in the same room with the US because it argues, and frankly, honestly, that the US quit the deal and so is not a party to it anymore. So all of this is being done through mediators, primarily from the European Union and the E3, Britain, France, and Germany. Fast forward to November of last year, talks resumed again, ups, downs. By early March of this year, it looked like there was a deal. And the European negotiators were even taking selfies and congratulating themselves that they had a draft agreement, something like 25 pages long. But there were new wrinkles. The Russians, who were party to it, tried to squeeze some more sanctions relief out of it for them, which was not possible in the aftermath of their invasion of Ukraine. There were various issues that were raised, dropped, primarily by the Iranians, having to do with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. There was an attempt to get them off the State Department terrorism list. Iran dropped that. Then they started to demand that a separate probe by the International Atomic Energy Agency into traces of uranium found at 3 sites that hadn't been declared to the IAEA, that this had to be resolved before they'd get back in the deal. There are other demands having to do with guarantees that a future US administration will not withdraw from the agreement again, guarantees that are frankly impossible under the US system. So after various ups, downs, the champagne is still in the refrigerator. Nobody's popping any corks. But you're right, Lauren, there is an opportunity in New York for the parties to talk directly, indirectly about the remaining obstacles and still try to clinch this deal, which remains in the profound interest, I think, of the international community and of Iran, which will gain access to $100 billion in frozen oil revenues and also be able to sell a great deal more oil, double or triple the amount of oil that it's exporting now. to a Europe and Asia that is frankly hungry for it because of the various restrictions on Russia. So it's still possible, but it has been a very difficult road with a lot of obstacles and psychological ups and downs. I hope that's my capsule summary.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for that wonderful context. That was really helpful. So, what are you keeping an eye on during the UN General Assembly, and do you expect that any progress will be made by the parties in New York?
Well, as you mentioned, the chief Iranian nuclear negotiator, Ali Bagheri, is supposed to be part of the entourage. And the political directors of the E3, Britain, France, and Germany, are also supposed to be in New York. Rob Malley will be in New York. And of course, many presidents and heads of state, including the Iranian president, Raisi. So there is an opportunity for some discussions on the sidelines to see if they can resolve what appear to be the final issues. Hopefully, they can reach some sort of compromise on this question of the IAEA and the investigation into these particles of uranium found at 3 sites. The Iranians basically want the IAEA to promise that if they answer the questions that have been raised, the IAEA will close the file and will never bother them again. Again, IAEA can't promise them that. If there's new information that comes to light under Iran's safeguards agreement, the IAEA has to investigate. But perhaps Iran will finally tell the truth about where these traces of uranium came from, why they had them, why they didn't declare the sites. Now, Iran has been reluctant to do so because Iran has never admitted that it did any research into weaponization. But US intelligence and others certainly believe that Iran did do some research, that mostly this program ended in 2003. So can Iran find a way to finesse this and satisfy the concerns of the IAEA? That will be very important. And the other is the question of guarantees. Again, I don't know what more the US can do or say beyond promising that the Biden administration will remain in the deal as long as Iran does. That's really about as good as it gets. There have been some other formulas suggested about monetary compensation and so on, but it's difficult to see how a current administration can make ironclad guarantees for a future one.
Right. Well, fingers crossed that we end up with a deal, and good luck to everyone in New York. And Barbara, we are out of time, but thank you so much for joining me today.
You are quite welcome. Thanks for asking.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Shing, the Communications and Marketing Specialist at Plowshares Fund. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has exposed just how close nuclear escalation and nuclear war can be. To meet the urgency of this moment, Plowshares Fund has launched a donation match challenge to make the largest grants possible to those who are working every day to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons. Right now, all first-time gifts will be matched dollar for dollar, and all new monthly gifts will be matched at their 12-month value. Or increase your giving and the full amount above your last gift will be matched. Go to plowshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
The war in Ukraine may be entering a decisive new phase. Over the past few weeks, Ukrainian forces have successfully counterattacked in the northeast, forcing Russia to retreat. To mark the occasion, Ukrainian President Zelensky traveled to the region to raise the Ukrainian flag. Ukraine's surprising advances and Russia's losses have sparked optimism about Ukraine's chances of victory. Unfortunately, Russia's retreat has also revealed evidence of mass graves and war crimes, as we have seen in other areas. While it may be too early to say whether this is a turning point in the war, Ukraine hopes it can press its advantage and push Russia out of Ukraine. But many questions remain, such as, has Ukraine gained the upper hand in the war, or will Russia regroup and push back? If President Putin is pushed into a corner, how will he respond? And has Ukraine's success changed the outlook for how the war might end? To help us understand this situation, today we are joined by Kimberly St. Julian Varnon. She is a PhD student in history at the University of Pennsylvania. Go UPenn. We've got 2 kids there. Great to see. And she holds an MA in Russian, East European, and Central Asian Studies from Harvard University. Kimberly, so great to have you here.
Thank you for having me back. I always love our conversations.
Me too. So, Kimberly, Let's start with the beginning of the recent news. The war seemed to have settled into a stalemate until just recently. Tell us what happened, what's happening in the conflict, how surprised you are about recent events, and how significant are Ukraine's recent advances?
So for the past couple of weeks, so the mid-September, we've seen a pretty significant Ukrainian counteroffensive, particularly in the Luhansk region of eastern Ukraine. Admittedly, it's been surprising how much success Ukraine has had. They've retaken a few of the Russian-occupied villages in Luhansk. Izum, it was probably the kind of the starting point of the success of this counteroffensive. And Izum is where President Zelensky has said that they have found a mass grave with over 400 human remains. So what we've seen is Ukraine has been successful not only at retaking these villages, but they're villages that have meaning to the Russian military effort. So you have them cutting Russian suppliers off from resupplies, but also making it hard for Russia to have an orderly retreat. So these are two very big parts of the Ukrainian counteroffensive against Russia. But, and I hate to rain on the parade, but I also like to be realistic. The question becomes, how long can Ukraine sustain this counteroffensive, but also how will Russia respond to it? We've seen an uptick in Russian bombing, particularly focusing on civilian areas, which Russia tends to do after it's had a military setback in Ukraine. And so there are also discussions of more explosions and things like that in Kherson, which is also in eastern Ukraine. So you have the problem of when Russia has military setbacks, it tends to respond in kind with civilian atrocities. And so that's also on the radar. Another thing is President Zelensky, I think it's the Yalta Security Conference a few days ago, he said that the next 90 days will make or break the Ukrainian war effort. It will also make or break Europe. And so he's talking about the fact that in the next 90 days, we'll be getting into winter. And if you said anything about Russian and Soviet history, winter is always important. The joke was like Napoleon and Hitler lost to the most important general, the Russian winter. But not only in terms of combat and on the ground, the most important thing is this is going to question the strength of European sanctions. How long can Europe go without Russian oil and gas when its population is facing winter, but also rising food and staple prices and inflation? So I think that's what President Zelensky was talking about in that speech he gave a few days ago.
Now, a lot of people have been speculating that this is a major turnaround for Russia, that Russia can't recover from this, that this somehow shows that the Russian military effort here is crumbling from within. What do you think? Is this the beginning of the end for Russia, or can they regroup and push back?
I hope that it's the beginning of the end to Russia, but I doubt that it is. So since the beginning of this war, I think Russia's made it very clear this will be a war of attrition. And much like in the Soviet period, wars of attrition, it doesn't matter how many soldiers you lose. The overall goal is to win. And that is definitely in Putin's long-term goal here. And so you have these competing forces. You have one Ukrainian counteroffensive, but also Ukraine, and President Zelensky has been masterful at this. Ukraine is also really good at controlling the media narrative and trying to keep Western media attention in particular on the Ukrainian war effort. Because they learned in 2014 what happens when Western media stops paying attention. You get a Russian-occupied Crimea and a Russian-occupied Luhansk and Donetsk. So what's going to happen is Ukraine has to keep up the media attention. It has to stop and fight against Western media exhaustion. It has to also try to keep pressure on European governments to keep sanctions on Russia and not go towards the easy oil and gas as they did in 2014. But also you have the situation of Russia will continue to throw as many bodies as it can in Ukraine until it gets what it wants. And so what I see happening for us to see a big change in the Russian military effort is going to require some domestic changes in Russia. It's going to require people to not be in the military. It's going to require some domestic unrest. And we just haven't seen anything noticeable, since February 24th that would depict that that's something that's going to happen.
Now, President Putin just met with Chinese leader Xi, and Putin had to address China's questions and concerns about the war, which was quite interesting. Do you think Russia's setbacks will force Putin to mobilize a larger war effort in Russia and to admit that things are not going well, which so far he really hasn't done?
This summit was a very big summit for Russia, but also this is the first time really Russia's having to answer to people that it actually sees as its political allies, China and Modi's India. And so I think that the pressure that the Chinese can put, like Xi can put on Putin, is something that no Western power can do, and it's certainly not what Russian domestically can do. It's like it's an international trade question, it's an international foreign policy question, but also Russia will be very limited if it doesn't have Chinese support. And so I think the flip side is this will probably lead to a greater Russian military presence, because I think the allies are kind of telling Russia, it's time to put this in the bag. Like, we're not going to support you for a long-term 2-year war effort in Ukraine. It's not beneficial to us. And so I think also the Russian economy is hurting. It's suffering quite a bit. And so the question is, will Putin be able to attain his goals before we see the ultimate collapse of the Russian economy? I think he's on a time crunch here, which means the pressure's working, but it could also have some negative effects for Ukraine, particularly for Ukrainian civilians.
Do you think Russia needs to now sort of mobilize the population in a more general way? And if so, what does that do to the overall Russian view towards the war?
This is the rock in the hard place, because if you watch Russian state media, the war is going great. It's going well. But the Ukrainian commander, the highest ranking commander, I think the report said over 54,000 Russian troops have been lost in Ukraine. So now you have the question of, where if the war is going well, why do we need to mobilize, right? So I think the story isn't going to work. At the end of the day, when you have, this autocratic government, that Putin can push the domestic populace to do what he wills, unless he's overthrown, and that doesn't look like it's going to happen. So I think things will get much more difficult for Russian citizens than they have been. I think you'll see a lot more general mobilization. It'll be a lot harder to get out of than possibly earlier mobilizations have been.
Now, if Putin thinks he's losing, and we don't really know what is going on in his brain, but if he thinks he's losing, there has been concern that he might consider doing something drastic out of desperation, such as using nuclear weapons in Ukraine to change the course of the war. In your view, how likely is that?
I don't see Putin using nuclear weapons in the war in Ukraine. And this is because Putin, as much as it seems like there is no method to his madness, there is. Putin is an astute student of the West, in Western politics and Western domestic politics in particular. And so Putin, I think, understands that he only needs to prolong this war enough to exhaust Western resources. And I mean, this is one of the key things about the Ukrainian offensive. It's been so successful because it has weapons from Germany, right? So you have to exhaust that. And the key way to exhaust that is to lengthen this out through the winter, make this a slog. And so I don't see the nuclear option for Putin, because he understands once nuclear weapons come, like, that's the end of Putinism. There is no way out of that. But what he can do, and what the Russians have done, you just continue to shell and weaken the Zaporozhian, atomic energy station. So it'll be a domestic problem for Ukraine, but we know blowback on Russia in terms of nuclear fallout. You haven't had a nuclear weapon. You've just caused an economic disaster like Chernobyl. And so I'm less worried about direct nuclear weapons. I'm more concerned about either Russian focus on Zaporozhye AES or Russians, neglecting it, which can also cause an atomic problem. But all of those would harm Ukraine and not necessarily harm Russia.
So that's very interesting. So you're suggesting that rather than go for a nuclear weapons option, Putin might focus his attention on Zaporizhia. So, and clearly there's been a lot of attention on Zaporizhia lately. So let's talk about that for a second. The IAEA sent a delegation there. At this point, the reactors appear to be shut down, and hopefully that will lead to a safer situation, right, where eventually, as the fuel cools, there's less of a concern of power loss and fuel meltdown. So we seem to be moving to a better place, although, of course, the IAEA is calling for a demilitarization of the region, and there's no sense that that is happening. Where do you see that situation going, and how might Russia then escalate there if Putin felt he needed to do something dramatic to change how things are going in Ukraine?
So I think this is a terrifying thing. And this has been kind of on my radar since they started bombing and occupying Zaporizhia, is there's a lot of damage neglect can do. And so like Zaporizhzhia, right now, the only power it's producing is the power to keep the station going. Once that power's out, chaos, right? And there's also possible deniability. The Russians can say, oh, we didn't know we were hitting the power plant or the power source of AES. And this is, I'm reading it like in Ukrainian, it's Zaporizhzhia AES, but the atomic energy station. So I think that's the concern, is that focusing on Zaporizhzhia and the atomic energy station, it allows Russia to still obtain these goals in terms of critically destabilizing Ukraine, creating an ecological catastrophe, but also it will require the depeopling of that area. But the question becomes, if that happens, what will be the fallout on Russia? What more can we do to Russia? And I think that's something we have to think about, because Putin has most certainly thought about that. What more can be done? Sanctions, blocking visas for travel, particularly for members of the Kremlin, those don't necessarily, outweigh the ability to cause destruction to Ukraine that will destabilize Ukraine for years.
So from that perspective, you would expect Russia to maintain a threat over Zaporizhzhia, just to sort of keep that fear factor going, that if he needs to, Putin can basically create a devastating situation there.
He can. And it's worked in terms of, since 2014, because of the occupation of Crimea, because of the Russian destabilization of Luhansk and Donetsk, it has slowed Ukraine's ability to try to join the EU, to have stronger EU association agreements. Ukraine has always been seen as destable since 2014. And this will just be another addition to that. So if you have this ecological atomic disaster in Ukraine, someone has to rebuild, someone has to pay to, do all of this work. And so then the question becomes a domestic politics question for these EU countries. How much more money can we spend on Ukraine? With inflation, all of these things come together. And that's why I think it's important for people to remember, and this is Zelensky's point of this is not a Ukrainian crisis. This is a European crisis. It's a European continent-wide crisis. I think he sees that wide lens.
In your view, how has this changed the outlook for the rest of the war and how the war might end? In other words, is Ukraine changing its war aims and goals as a result of recent events?
One, it's been a boon for Ukrainians across the world, refugees, but also Ukrainians in Ukraine and the fighting forces. And that's been necessary. It's been needed. But also, I don't think the Ukrainian effort and the goal has changed. The goal has been all of Ukraine under Ukrainian control. And so the idea that Russia has had, and originally when this war started, I always thought Russia will say it wants all of Ukraine, but it'll settle for Luhansk and Donetsk, most of the east. So the problem becomes, and we've seen this in Russian state media, they've said, that's all they're interested in. But Zelensky has said from day one, he said this to his Western European allies, we want all of Ukraine, that there is no settlement in which any part of Ukraine is under Russian control. And he sticks by that, and he has to, because that's what Ukrainians want. And so at the end of the day, the question will become, how long will Russia be willing to slog through this? Not how long will Ukraine fight. Ukraine will fight to the last Ukrainian. But the question becomes, how long will Western powers continue to support the Ukrainian war effort? Without the arms from Germany, without the support of Ukraine, American military money and supplies, without all of these supports, Ukraine can't continue to have a powerful counteroffensive to Russia. And so a lot of these things of what the Ukrainian goal is, that will not change, but its way to achieve that goal may have to.
One last thing is, what's next? Where do you see this going from here?
So I think the next stage will be Ukraine will continue its counteroffensives to, mitigate any ability of Russia to withdraw in an orderly fashion. It will also continue to focus on destroying Russian supply lines. Those are two incredibly important elements of this. But the next thing that Ukraine's going to have to think about is not only feeding and clothing its military, because the winter is about to start. And that will be something that's a new facet of this war in terms of a second winter. But also, I think in terms of the media and Western politics, Zelensky is going to continue to have to put in a very strong face for Western media and continue to demand from his Western allies continued support. And he's been very good at that. So I think he'll continue to do that. We will not be seeing less of Zelensky. He will remain in the news and keeping Ukraine front and center.
Kimberly, thank you so much for your time, and we wish you the best in all of your work.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billet, Angela Kellett, and Alex Hall. Audio engineering in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyric Spawn and Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.